Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we return to the dominating story, not just of this year, but of a lifetime, the global pandemic of COVID-19. It was in this very hospital at St Thomas's in April that Prime Minister Boris Johnson found out by personal experience the full health impact of COVID-19. He pulled through, but more than 41,000 UK citizens have not been so fortunate. A matter of weeks ago, it was possible to say, at least in most European countries, that they had the virus under some degree of control, and therefore life was beginning to return to some degree of normality. However, since then there's been setback after setback, as country after country have had to face up to sustained clusters of the virus. The holiday destinations of Europe have been marked not by crowds flocking to the beach, but anxious tourists heading for the coast to avoid the next lockdown or quarantine. To find out where the world now stands, Alex turns to two world-ranking experts on the pandemic, virologist Dr. Chris Smith of the Naked Scientist fame and Chair of University College London Intensive Care Unit, Professor Hugh Montgomery. But first, let's look at the reviews of last week's show on the Liberal Democrat leadership race with your tweets, messages and emails. Lynn says, interesting show. I don't think the Lib Dems will get in power in any parliament. Bob Howie says, when it comes to it, does it really matter? Joe says, the Lib Dems are not a serious party anymore. Ian Bruce says, Layla Moran will be as successful as Joe Swinson. The wee Ben says, not that they're spoilt for choice, but if I were a Lib Dem, I would go for Ms Moran. And finally, Peter says, watch your recent Lib Dem interviews with Vince Cable. Really enjoyed the shows. I'll be back. It's a refreshing change. Well, thank you, Peter.
The Naked Scientist podcast, an international radio show, has made Chris Smith one of the best-known virologists in the world. Back in February, when President Donald Trump was forecasting a bad case of the flu, he warned on this show that instead we could be facing down the barrel of a global pandemic. Meanwhile, Professor Hugh Montgomery has been on the front line of emergency care in London, seeking to minimise the death rate from this vicious virus. They both join me in the studio.
Hello, Alex.
Morning. Chris, can I start with you? What do we know 8 months into this pandemic? What do we know about the spread now of this virus, and in particular these renewed clusters which are happening in so many countries?
I think the real wake-up call for everybody has been that where previously we regarded this as a bit like influenza, in the sense that if you had symptoms, you had it. If you didn't have symptoms, you probably didn't have it. Now we realise that a very significant proportion of people, maybe 2/3 of people who catch this new coronavirus, have no symptoms. And this has been its major success story from a virus point of view, because it's been very successful at hiding in plain sight. We're finding it very hard to track because people can catch it, they don't know they've got it, they don't know they're passing it on to people, but the people who they pass it on to can have very severe symptoms sometimes and can become profoundly unwell. And this is the amazing thing that's really taken us by surprise.
Chris, well, what do you mean by a successful virus? I mean, that's almost embodying it with sentient qualities.
Well, I hope I'm not giving that impression, but a virus is just an infectious bag of genes. The only thing a virus wants, in inverted commas, to do is to make more viruses. And the way it does that is by becoming optimized so that it's very good at spreading, it's very, very good at getting into the cells that grow more viruses, it's very good at outwitting an individual's immune system for long enough to enable it to grow lots of viruses, and then it's very good at jumping off that person into other people. And this is a kind of game of cat and mouse between a person's immune system and the virus. And viruses evolve. All viruses evolve and change, and they do so in such a way to keep themselves in circulation. And different viruses have different strategies for doing that. But this coronavirus, because it's a short-lived infection, you get it and you quite quickly get immune to it, and therein might lie the root of some of the other problems it causes, but because of that, it's got to be very efficient at jumping from one person to the next. And one way to do that is to fool people into not thinking there's anything wrong with them, because then they don't change their behaviour at all, and they carry on business as usual, and they pass the virus on to other people. And if you have that under your belt as a virus, it means you've got the best prospects of spreading to as many individuals who can grow you, replicate you, and make more of you than you possibly can get.
Professor Montgomery, eminent professor, but also I've been working in the front line in intensive care in London. What have you learned about the range of symptoms that this vicious virus causes?
A lot, and it was quite a steep learning curve, because when we were first hit with this, we were expecting, I was expecting, nothing more than, much as Chris described, bad flu with a pneumonitis, so a viral infection of the lung. And I was thinking, well, we know how to manage those. We see it with flu and other things. It'll just be a giant turkey baste. We'll just rack the patients up. We know how to manage them and we'll be quite good at it. But what we weren't prepared for was that this virus was assaulting a huge diversity of organs. So firstly, it's not just lung tissue, it's blood vessels. And a lot of the problem with lung is that we're getting clotting forming in the big blood vessels of the lung, but also the small blood vessels, and that disrupts the blood flow and gas exchange in the lung. It was taking out kidneys at a rate that we really weren't expecting. We often see kidneys petering out on intensive care, but these kidneys were doing well, and then they would just suddenly crash and burn. And we now know that the virus is directly attacking the kidney and very cleverly is causing the kidney to increase the numbers of receptors that the virus uses to get into the kidney. Muscle was badly affected. We weren't expecting that. There's an enzyme chemical that your muscle releases, and you normally have a level, let's say, up to maybe 110 or 120. The first patient we saw in had a level of 249,000. And we became quite used to seeing levels in the tens of thousands. So muscle was affected and brain was affected. We early on started seeing people coming in with confusional states, fits that they'd never had before. And then from intensive care, we started finding that people weren't waking up as we expected. And sometimes that was due to strokes, and sometimes it's been due to direct involvement of the brain. So this isn't just a bit of flu. It's not just a bit of a lung infection. It's an every organ infection.
Now, that range of infections sounds very, very frightening indeed. What does that tell us, Professor Montgomery, about the potential longer-term effects? I mean, those who actually survive but could have long-term debilitating health conditions?
Well, we're certainly beginning to see this now. And in fact, we were alerted to it very early on in that we arranged a Zoom meeting with the Royal College of General Practitioners and the Intensive Care Society to trade notes, essentially. And it was the GPs that we were telling them, look, this is what we're seeing on ITU, and there seems a long tail of recovery because people are very, very debilitated. We thought it was nothing more than that, several weeks of being ventilated on an intensive care, having your lungs go down. It would take a long time to recover from that. And we know that actually from critical illness, it can take 5 years and people still aren't fully recovered from general severe intensive care. But the general practitioners were saying, well, we're seeing out here people who get this coronavirus who seem to linger on for weeks before they slowly recover a bit, but they're still weeks later complaining of breathlessness, fatigue, and sleepiness, and so forth. And friends of mine who've had it call it, COVID brain. They say, my brain just didn't work properly for weeks and weeks and weeks afterwards. They describe a sort of foggy sensation for that. And still this level of fatigue and sleepiness. Now, we don't know what's causing that directly. Chris may have better data. My guess is that we are seeing in some cases some sort of an autoimmune thing set up. So your body, in attacking the virus, is being exposed to a bunch of proteins it doesn't normally see, like those from muscle, and that we may be seeing a setup where the body continues to attack itself. I've got no evidence for that yet, and from Chris's intimation, he may have such data, but that would be my guess. We've got some patients with badly damaged lungs and clots on their lungs, and that causes long-term symptoms that have got weak muscle that will take time to come back. But then on top of that, we may have some other process going on, and that would be a guess at the moment for me.
Dr. Smith, from a virologist point of view at Cambridge, do you have the data which shows the virus behaving in that sort of manner?
It seems to fall into two phases. There's this acute phase, which is definitely caused by the physical presence of the virus. Because when viruses infect cells and grow in those cells, they damage cells. And when they damage cells, they cause inflammation, and inflammation attracts the immune system to move in and then do onward damage to tissue. And most of those effects are immediately manifest in the respiratory tract. So it hits the lungs, and this is why you see the symptoms that people present with, which is they get breathless. there can be, under certain circumstances early on, also onward infection of heart muscle tissue and other organs, including possibly the liver and kidneys, and possibly also the nervous system. We've just published some information on that. But what then happens is you move into phase 2, and the person usually gets rid of the virus, but the disease doesn't stop there. In fact, it can intensify and also broaden in terms of its presentation. And there are people with symptoms that last for months. They're dubbing themselves the long-haul COVID sufferers. And what appears to be happening in these people is that there is some kind of almost like biochemical footprint left behind by the physical presence of the virus, which, even though it's now gone, that metabolic footprint continues. And there is onward damage to tissues in the body. We think that at least part of this is down to the immune system, and that the immune system has been reshaped by the virus infecting you, and that in the course of fighting off the virus, the immune system is being directed to attack healthy tissue that it would normally regard as non-hostile. And we don't know exactly why that's happening. But also, intriguingly, we have sent hundreds of samples that we collected at the University of Cambridge to our collaborators at Murdoch University in Perth, where they've set up something recently. It's called the Australian National Phenome Centre, and they can process thousands and thousands of samples very fast to look for hundreds or even thousands of different molecules that are present in samples. And what we're looking for are chemical fingerprints, as it were, unique combinations of chemicals at different concentrations that can change when a person has this infection. And having done this, what we are seeing, and we've just published some of this data this week, there is a characteristic pattern that is left, almost, as I say, like footprints, biochemically in a person after they've had severe COVID. Now, we don't think this is present in everybody. We think this is present in people who have COVID, which is the disease that this virus causes in some people. We don't know why they have these lasting legacy effects, but we can see clear metabolic disturbance in these people. And we think that this is, at least in part, why people are presenting with these long-term symptoms. What the long-term for these people will be, though, and how long this is going to be, and whether they're going to go back to normal, if ever, at the moment we just don't know.
Professor Montgomery, the virologists are sharing information worldwide. How about the intensive care community? How much have you learned from each other and how to deal with the most acute symptoms of this virus?
A very great deal is the answer. So in Britain, within the first few days, we were having telephone calls with one another, and then indeed national meetings held online of every major intensive care centre, sharing what they were seeing. And in fact, it was a massive benefit to us, because these things we weren't expecting, the kidney problems, the blood clot problems, were flagged within days, because people were saying, we've seen one of these, has anyone else? And people were able to say, yeah, we've seen 3 or 4 of those too. And we very rapidly expanded that to international meetings from as far away as in calls with Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Britain, but also Korea, Iran, a vast number of places where they were seeing these cases, and indeed China, where we were able to compare notes very quickly. And that was a real lesson learned there, actually. Rather than waiting for publication and the traditional scientific way of spreading information, we were able to do it very rapidly by word of mouth. So I think we have a very much better understanding now of the problems we see, and we certainly have a better handle on how to manage them. But there's an ongoing process, indeed, that's already begun for us to very quickly dive in to say, well, what do we know? But what are the known unknowns? What are the bits where we still have a big gap that we need to learn very quickly before winter strikes? And we're doing that by starting to compare major centres that have got differing outcomes to say, well, how much of this can we ascribe to a different case mix? Older people, different background diseases and so forth. But how much can we find a way where one centre was doing something slightly differently? And maybe they were doing that thing and it made a difference, an outcome was better. And that's a process that we're urgently progressing at the minute to see if we can find the little differences that might make the big differences in outcome.
Join us after the break, where our 2 top experts examine the race for a vaccine. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Cambridge virologist Chris Smith and Professor Hugh Montgomery are in conversation with Alex.
Guys, where are we with these renewed clusters that are taking place, even in the most successful countries, the countries which dealt with the virus best, are seeing renewed clusters? What's going on there, Chris Smith?
The reason this is happening, put simply, is that as far as we can tell, the vast majority of the world population has not had coronavirus. The estimates we have are that about 95% of the UK population, and we're similar to pretty much every other country that we've seen data for, have not had the virus. But because the problem remains and the population remains susceptible, as soon as we start to afford the virus more avenues through which it can spread, things like people socialising, people becoming complacent about social distancing, things like the hospitality industry opening up again, those sorts of avenues will afford the virus chances to spread. It's taking them, and that's why we're seeing resurgences, not just in this country, but in many countries. In Australia, in the state of Victoria, they've got a state of disaster and a curfew in place. This was a country that had an excellent track record. New Zealand, they've broken their 100-day-long streak of not having any cases at all, with a new resurgence in Auckland mushrooming at the moment. They have no idea, they're looking, but they have no idea where that came from. Same with Germany. Belgium's got problems, France has got problems, Spain's got problems, Italy's now got problems. It is not about how good your country was at the start of all of this. It's all about the fact that we remain a susceptible population. The virus hasn't gone away, and therefore, given half a chance, sure as eggs is eggs, and as Arnold Schwarzenegger said, I will be back.
Professor Montgomery, the complacency which seems to be setting in to some extent with some people's attitude to the virus, do you think that's because the morbidity rate, the death rate seems to be falling? But of course that doesn't mean that the sort of symptoms and long-term effects that you alluded to earlier aren't still there. Is it something to do with that people seem to be adopting a more casual attitude to catching this virus?
Well, I think it probably is. I think Chris is absolutely spot on. We've got to remember that this is the same virus that was there 8 weeks ago. It's just as infectious, it's just as lethal. And the reason that the death rates have fallen have really just been not because doctors are very, very clever, it's because people have behaved themselves. They've maintained social distance, they've used alcohol gel and they've washed their hands, they've worn masks, and they've done what they were asked to do. And that's why infection rates fell, not because the virus is different. And the death rates fell purely as a function of the reduced number of cases. Now, it's fair to say that if we do get another big surge, we may be slightly better at managing this in hospitals than we were before. We now know that there are blood clots that happen, and they would have killed people early on because we didn't know they were coming. And we now have dexamethasone, the steroid, which we know in theory should be able to reduce intensive care admissions by 30%. But these are marginal gains on a population scale infection. And the worst thing that people can think is, well, the case numbers are relatively low, although I would agree with Chris that up to 1,000 cases a day is still quite a lot. That they go, well, the mortality rate's low without understanding why, and that they go back to behaving as normal. Because if they go back to where we were before, that old saying, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. And we will get the tinderbox that Chris described will ignite, and we will have a flood of severe cases again.
Chris Smith, you mentioned the hospitality industry earlier. I mean, if you think about transmission system, a perfect transmission system for this virus, then a pub environment would seem to tick all the dreadful boxes. I mean, is it compatible in any country to have a pub hospitality environment and keep this virus under control?
It's a challenge. And you've got to think of it in terms of, and the way the government are approaching this is as a numbers game. If we look in Ireland, for example, they've generated some data showing that about 2/3 of their cases are in the under 45 age group. In Sweden, for which I've seen data, the 20 to 29-year age group had more cases than all other ages put together in that country. You'll also notice that when Boris Johnson came out at the beginning of the month with Chris Whitty, and Chris Whitty used those immortal words, we're at the limit of what we think we can do, there may have to be some trade-offs. And the hospitality industry was cited as one of those possible trade-offs. And indeed, in order to meet the obligation to try to get schools back in business, which again is going to afford the virus more opportunities to spread, it may well be that we have to row back on some of these other potential avenues for transmission, and that would include things like the hospitality industry. But remember, people are still expected to be sensible in these venues. When you go to the pub, it's not a free-for-all. You're not allowed to loiter at the bar, although people probably still do abuse the system a bit. You're supposed to sit at tables, it's supposed to be table service, and because it's regarded as an indoor venue, even though most people are trying to go outside, it's still supposed to be two households getting together, which is analogous to two households getting together in their own house. So steps have been taken in the planning to try to mitigate and minimise the risks that are attendant when you go to one of these places, but because they are not essential in the same way that other things like schooling is, it may well be that they are the sacrificial lamb that we have to close those down if we see uncontrolled spread subsequently. But that may be done on a region by region basis. Let's hope it is.
And finally, gentlemen, let's look at the search for a cure, the search for a vaccine. And first, Professor Montgomery, the palliative drugs that have been introduced, in your experience on the front line, how effective are these treatments? How effective are they being?
Well, in honesty, in Great Britain, we haven't really had the chance to demonstrate their efficacy outside of a trial. So the big game changer, or the biggest game changer so far in terms of drugs for use in patients with the disease, has been the steroid treatment, dexamethasone. It's a very, very cheap drug. It's been around for ages and ages, decades and decades for different treatments. So we understand it very well. And I say very, very cheap, very easy to deploy, very few side effects. And the trial data suggests that we can reduce mortality from the worst affected patients by around 30%. And the boring stuff about anticoagulation, keeping blood thin, that will indeed make a difference too. Now, we've got upwards of 26 different organisations trying to make a vaccine at the moment. Now, that's a positive thing because each of them will be taking a slightly different approach. And this is excellent. It means we've hedged bets. And indeed, this government in Britain has purchased from 6 different suppliers, again, hedging their bets to over 300 million different vaccine doses. But would I be an optimist? I'm a great deal more optimistic now than I was 10 weeks ago, when I thought that the odds were perhaps against us getting a vaccine readily and against us being able to deploy it fast. I'm now slightly more optimistic to say that I think we may well get a vaccine that is effective and that we may well be able to deploy it at scale and speed. But my guess would be that that's still looking at quite a long tail to achieve that, that this isn't going to be done by Christmas. This is going to be probably another year before we've got this under control, would be my best guess.
And finally, Dr. Chris Smith, where are we internationally? There's the Sputnik from Russia, the 2 Chinese vaccines in the field, the Western options that Professor Hugh Montgomery has alluded to. Where do you think we are internationally, and how much sharing is going on in the international community in terms of this search for a vaccine?
I think we're in very good shape. There are more than, I think, 23 different products are now in clinical trials for this. These are different vaccine options which are being tested. So that's good, because we know when you ask a pharmaceutical company, how often do you expect to succeed when you make a new drug? You'll be alarmed to learn that actually it's all budgeted around a 90% failure rate. Pharmaceutical companies know that 90% of the time that when they start on an endeavour, it is not going to bear fruit. It's a 1 in 10 chance that we're going to hit the target, hit the bullseye. So the fact that there are 170 different vaccine initiatives running all around the world, and actually it is a big collaborative venture, is very reassuring. And so we need a range of options, and not all vaccines that we make in one country will be useful for all people in that one country. So we again need a range of options. I'd like to finish on making one point though, which is just to manage expectations a bit here, and point out that one thing that people seem to have overlooked is that in this rush for a vaccine is that we're all assuming that a vaccine will usher in this great panacea that will bring this whole thing to a close. And unfortunately, I don't believe that's going to be the case. And I don't believe that for the following reason. I looked up the data last year for measles. Now, measles has been around in the human race for about 2,000 years, since it jumped into us from animals in much the same way that coronavirus has probably jumped into us from animals. Now, last year, measles caused around the world 10 million cases of disease. It's a very severe infection, not quite as severe as COVID, but it still killed over 150,000 people internationally that we know about. And COVID has killed about 600,000 people. Okay, that's 4 times more, but COVID's done this once. Measles does this every year. And measles has a very successful vaccine. And in the UK last year, we had many, many cases of measles and many, many people who chose not to get vaccinated. So it is not a given that just because we have a vaccine, the job is done and the problem goes away. There are many outstanding issues. How long will that vaccine give us immunity for? How do we get it to 8 billion people on Earth, probably with more than 1 dose needed? And if we need to keep repeating that dosage every couple of years or so, how are we going to do that? There's an old saying, it's become an old saying since it was first mooted at the beginning of the year, if COVID is anywhere, COVID is everywhere. And it's absolutely true. This is a global problem. We need a global solution, but we all need to sign up to it.
And on that profoundly worrying note, Dr. Chris Smith, Professor Hugh Montgomery, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Pleasure, thank you.
Thank you.
In this pandemic, nothing is more certain than when any country drops its guard, then the virus comes roaring back. World-leading countries such as New Zealand have had to take strong measures to retain virus-free status, and even the tiny Faroes have had to cope with new clusters. Meanwhile, countries like the USA and Brazil, who've never been able to cope, are still heading up the unhappy league table of COVID victims. Countries heavily reliant on tourism end up fighting the virus on the beaches, and perhaps what is most difficult to understand is why any government anywhere believes that opening nightclubs or pubs can be done with impunity. In reality, every single country which had stuck its chin out at this virus has been hit and then hit again. One consolation is that the mortality rate has been falling everywhere, probably as a function of the younger age groups who are catching the contagion in the holiday season. Against this, as Professor Montgomery reminded us, the long-term effects are as yet little understood. Every indication is that a return to normality will have to wait a successful vaccine. Whether that race is won by Russia, China, or the many Western countries, the more important question is if a successful vaccine is indeed forthcoming. But even then, will it offer long-term protection? We are living through a nightmare, and as in the very worst of bad dreams, sometimes it is difficult to wake up. But for now, from Alex, myself, and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.